So this is my reading, commentary, and reflection on part 5 of Parmenides. I don't want to spend too much time on the pretext, because this is we're in the middle of an exercise. So I want to read the rest of this page and then go through it, interpret it, and then in the meantime, in the interim, perhaps report on some of the things that we have already come across and why they're relevant. So here Parmenides says, "Yet, on the other hand, we also say that it cannot be in anything." Yes, we do. Then it is also never in the same thing. Why? Because it would then be in that, and that same thing it is in. Of course. But it was impossible for it to be either in itself or in another. Yes, you're quite right. So the one is never in the same thing. It seems not. But what is never in the same thing neither enjoys repose nor is at rest. No, it cannot. Therefore the one, as it seems, is neither at rest nor in motion. It certainly does appear not. Furthermore, it won't be the same as another thing or itself. Nor, again, could it be different from itself or another thing. Why is that? If it were different from itself, it would surely be different from one. It would not be one. True. On the other hand, if it were the same as another, it would be that thing, and not itself. So in this way, too, it would not be just what it is, one, but would be different from one. Yes, you're quite right. Therefore, it won't be the same as another, or different from itself. No, it won't. And it won't be different from another, as long as it is one. For it is not proper to one to be different from something, but proper to different from another alone, and to nothing else. That's right. Therefore it won't be different by being one, or do you think it will? No, indeed. Yet, if it isn't different by being one, it will not be so by itself. And if it isn't so by itself, it will not itself be so. And if it is itself in no way different, it will be different from nothing. That's right. Nor will it be the same as itself. Why not? The nature of one is not, of course, also that of the same. Why? Because it is not the case that, whenever a thing comes to be the same as something, it comes to be one. But why? If it comes to be the same as the many, it must come to be many, not one. True. But if the one and the same in no way differ, whenever something came to be the same, it would always come to be one. And whenever it came to be one, it would always come to be the same. Certainly. Therefore, If the one is to be the same as itself, it won't be one with itself, and thus it will be one and not one. But this surely is impossible. Therefore, the one can't be either different from another or the same as itself. It can't. Thus, the one could be different from nor the same as itself or another. Yes, you're quite right. All right, so another set of confusing paragraphs here. So let's start with the first one that we read. And he says, yet on the other hand, we also say that it cannot be in anything. So I want to back up a little bit and talk about this one. The one is this hypothetical unity. But it's more than a unity. It's likely what we're talking about is a formal structure. That this oneness occupies a particular purity of unity, of identity. And it's difficult with language to describe it because of its fundamental aspects. Perhaps beneath the language that I use to describe it, it yet rests more fundamental. And that this term identity is still too proximal, or rather peripheral, to what I speak of. And so there's all sorts of difficulties that arise from something that is considered to be a pure unity. For all the things that we know that are, cannot be pure unities in and of themselves without having their being destroyed. So it seems to be of a type of being that is entirely, maybe not entirely, but that is different from that of the type of being that we encounter with the senses. Now Parmenides reiterates, he says, yet, on the other hand, we also say that it cannot be in anything. This is what the last paragraph was about, in some sense. Then it is also never in the same thing. A peculiar thing to say after saying that it's not in anything. So if it's not in the same thing, then of course it wouldn't be in something if it is not in anything, because any would include the same as well as different. But at least it gives us an idea of identifying something that is similar to or sameness of something. Now, if we say it's not in the same thing, it's a rather bizarre thing to say, because either we imply that there are more than one thing for which these things are the same, but they are separated by degrees. And of course, if it's going to be a purity, it's not going to be separated by degrees. It is not going to be, because that thing, that form, is going to be the thing that holds the densest series of characteristics or qualities that are possible to maintain the thing. And so having something of the same that's outside of it doesn't make any sense. We can have sameness that exists, of course. I have two chairs that are the same color, same build. Now, there's a way in which they are not the same, because they're not physically the same chair, but in terms of form, they are the same. So there are aspects to things that allow sameness to proliferate, just as being in general allows non-being to exist and differentiate among things. Now, when Aristotle asks why, his response is because it would then be in that same thing it is in. And of course, if it is in something, then it becomes a part. And if it is a part of something, it is not a pure unity, because there's difference within it that divides up these, what we would call characteristics, maybe, I don't know. Because it would then be in that same thing it is in. But it was impossible for it to be either in itself or in another. And now, why do we say that? In part because of something that we've mentioned. If it is inside of itself, it becomes a part of itself rather than itself. There's a separation of identity when we have this sort of telescoping selfhood. If it is to be the case that something is within itself, it has to have some difference in order for there to be identity. But if it's truly continuous as a being, as a purity, it wouldn't make sense to say that there is a self within the self. But it was impossible for it to be either in itself or in another. And of course, if it's part of another, then it's not a unity. It's a part of something else. It's a part of a multiplicity that comes together in a different unity. So the one is never in the same thing. So it's neither in the same thing in the sense that it is not in itself, nor is it in things that occupy some degree of sameness in the sensible order, like these two chairs, for example. But what is never in the same thing neither enjoys repose nor is at rest. So what we have to do here is to understand what repose is and what rest is. Now, the word repose is defined as a state of rest, sleep, or tranquility. The second definition, by lying, situated, or kept in a particular place. So this second definition would be a bit inconsistent with, I think, what we mean. Because a particular place is not something that belongs to the one. It's outside of space and time. But even the word rest, sleep, tranquil, I suppose, is a good word, I think, to think about. Free from disturbance or calm. Now, disturbance, I think, can have many different iterations, many different ways in which we can think about that. One way we can think about it is that there is some effect, that there is some change. And of course, the one doesn't undergo any change. It is constant. It is pure. And so by those means, it's something that it really is tranquil. And under that repose, I think we can accept the term tranquil because it is free from that disturbance. It is peaceful. Insofar as it is restful, it's not restful in the sense that it's not in motion, because I don't think motion has anything to do with it. Again, this is more of a term that has to do with the sensible order of the particulars. The one is not of the particulars. It precedes, it facilitates particularness. And to say that restful is this sort of pause in motion, I don't think would necessarily make sense. In the paragraph before the last line, he says, therefore it doesn't change places by going somewhere and coming to be in something, nor does it move by spinning in the same location or by being altered. It seems not. The one, therefore, is unmoved by every sort of motion, unmoved. So again he says, but what is never in the same thing, neither enjoys repose nor is at rest. So he's saying it doesn't enjoy repose, but it's also not in motion. So on the one hand, we could find ourselves into a way of understanding. So we get caught in this relativism by which we attribute some reason to the tranquility or repose to this thing. But probably in the way that he means is that it's motionless. And of course, just like the former, if we've established that it is unmoved, it at once means that it is, I think, something beyond motion. It doesn't really make sense to attribute something that is static or something that is dynamic to it. Therefore, the one, as it seems, is neither at rest nor in motion. So the logical conclusion there. Furthermore, he says, it won't be the same as another thing or itself. So this word sameness has come up a number of times. And although quite simple, I'd like to Google its definition. Now, same means identical and not different. Now, it's interesting, the sentence that is used here is, she was saying the same thing over and over. Now, if it was truly the same, she wouldn't be able to say it over and over, because there is difference between the two. There's difference just by virtue of measure, by measure of the length of time in between saying the two things. There's a lack of sameness or lack of identity in the fact of its separation. Now, there are ways in which we can understand it to be the same, by having the same meaning, the same context, and perhaps various other ways in which it might be the same. But But from an absolute standpoint, it's not really the same. The second definition is of an identical type, exactly similar. Now, of course, it doesn't necessarily mean or imply that if something is the same, that it is one identity. It implies difference. It implies two things. That something is similar to another or the same as something else. It implies that there is a degree of difference. And so sameness, I suppose, doesn't necessarily mean that altogether that there is no difference. There's a bit of a redundancy, I think. Or maybe not redundancy, but contradiction in what is being said in the word sameness, or in the word same, at least in the first definition. So he says, it won't be the same as another thing or itself. And the reason, again, is because although sameness means identical, it implies difference, regardless of what it says. That is not different, but it's not different under a certain context. It's not different. Let's say I've two books that are the same book. I've bought two copies of the same book. I say that they are the same. Their identities are not the same, but they are the same grounded in a relative context, meaning that these two books, in relation to all other things, share such a similarity of composition, purpose, structure, that they are to be identified as belonging together. But it is necessary by difference to have a separation in identity, because if you're going to call something the same as something else, just by virtue of there being something else, there is difference. Now, the other interesting thing is when he says, it won't be the same as another thing or itself. So I think the principle here is the same, but on one hand, we're comparing it between another thing, which would be like our book analogy, and then itself. So let's say we compare myself to myself. Does this make sense? Not really. Again, there's this idea that sameness implies difference. So if I'm going to say that I, myself, am the same as myself, that would be more of a redundant statement. But if we are to say that I'm going to compare myself to myself under a particular context, like separated by some dimensional quality, by time, I can say that there is a difference between who I am today and who I was a week ago. My disposition might have changed slightly. And surely I can extend it out and say, I'm different than I was a couple of years ago. But under this circumstance, while I'm comparing something that is quite similar, there are some subtle differences in which this sameness continues in that vein. In fact, it's more of an experience of difference rather than in the first example, where we might have some material thing that is very similar in composition. Nor, again, could it be different from itself or another thing. And this is even more straightforward, because instead of the subtleness and the contextual relevance that comes with sameness, I think when we speak of difference explicitly, it's more clear how the one being something that is purely identity, or purely maybe we can say purely capacity, while itself is not the thing that is affected or is affecting. It is the thing that, again, facilitates. I have to get away from this word and find something a little bit better. It is pure intelligibility, pure understanding. Nor again could it be different from itself or another thing. So actually, this might be useful to think about it in a different light. Now, in terms of difference, if we think about being, difference is there to identify. It is to make boundaries, to establish identities, to make firm those identities. And while there are things about identity themselves that are coherent and stable, they are still exposed to change. And this is not a quality of the one. And so by consequence, difference does not have a role to play in that thing. The thought that sort of runs through my mind now is where exactly we are in terms of talking about the forms, because the one doesn't seem to be a form. It seems to be the form of forms, if we will. Now Aristotle responds, he says, why is that? If it were different from itself, it would surely be different from one. It would not be one. On the other hand, if it were the same as another, it would be that thing. Now here, I have a slight disagreement. It would be similar to that thing. Again, we can extend sameness to a degree. If we are comparing things and calling it the same as something else, there can be the separation by difference. Or we can mean it in the sense that there's a direct equivalence, but because the mind sees it in a particular context, it may not recognize it in another until it's afforded a broader picture. And so in this sort of perceptual space, that's also, I think, possible to see sameness and another while it maintaining a sense of equivalency. So again, on the other hand, if it were the same as another, it would be that thing and not itself. So in this way too, it would not just... So in this way too, it would not be just what it is, one, but would be different from one. Therefore, it won't be the same as another or different from itself. And, he says, it won't be different from another so long as it is one. A statement I think he's repeated in so many words. But again, oneness in this way, in the sense of purity, implies that difference here does not have an effect. It cannot divide it. It cannot be divided from other things. And so here again I have to wonder about the scale of this thing that we're calling the one. That in the sophist we established this, the being and non-being as they participate with each other. And there's this sort of pluralism, of course, that emerges, but all the same now we are tasked with keeping some of this structure, but then trying to understand the one in a way that is coherent and is possible to participate with what we understand about being and non-being. And so the question becomes, being and non-being, if they are to exist in something, or if they are to come to be in something, then it is the thing that they come to be in that is not necessary to participate in the way that they are affected by capacity, but rather to afford these I wanted to say strings by which they can exist, but this is not a good analogy. So today is New Day. It happens to be Christmas today. And yesterday I took a day off for Christmas Eve, spending time with family, and I wasn't able to get to the reading. But now with a fresh mind, I think it'll be good to get back into this. So, like this usually does, the reflection comes back on some central point, and that central point happens to be the relationship between the one, the pure unity, and everything else. In fact, everything on the surface level that we perceive. It is of the particular, it is of the sensible, and all of this all of that which is sensible, and through which we come to understand the patterns of the world, the patterns of the human experience, the human expression, consciousness, self-awareness. All of this is happening at a particular level with particular constraints. And we know by our advancements, our tools of perception that extend our own perception, we are aware of bounds that are outside of our limits of perception. By these we can expand our understanding and our knowledge. But also philosophically and intellectually or subjectively, we are also aware of this particular thing of purpose end of, if we had for a moment to move away from the subject and try to be, I don't want to say try to be as rational as I can here. I don't want to sound like Sam Harris, but in a sense to satisfy that side of things, so we don't get caught in this place of arbitrary definition and imprecise language. The philosophical side of this, as we consider thingness itself and coming into being and the orientation of that process, what we are trying to do is to establish a relationship between an underlying structure that affords it, that needs no beginning to be afforded in and of itself. It doesn't need to undergo the standard process of becoming and of creation, because it is the thing that, again, it's the structural components that allow for it to exist. A home is not allowed to exist until the structure is in place. It would make zero sense to call a basic framed structure without any walls a home. Now we can sort of, in a tongue-in-cheek sort of way, but there has to be a sufficient amount of protection, I think, to fulfill the identity of the home, for it to become that thing that fulfills the purpose. And in a similar manner, I think we see the one, whereas the frame is just sort of there perpetually. But the frame, and this is something that I wager, partly because of my experience, is that the frame exists, but the frame also exists to participate in a particular purpose. There are many purposes, though, that I can identify that things, even outside of human influence, participate in. And we could say purposes, we can also say, as we have been for the last while, the constituents of identity, that of multiplicity and singularity or unity. There are things in the most base sense, in the most material sense that we can imagine. Had to move my microphone because my cat decided to jump on my lap. We think about a rock, for example. Something quite simple molecularly. Let's say it's non-composite, so it's relatively uniform in its elemental makeup, and its elemental makeup, and perhaps many other characteristics that we can identify. Having something simple, I think, is a good example to use. This thing, we can still run through the intellectual exercise of purpose, and it's obvious that the various things, the various parts of something that is relatively uniform, in the case of this rock, still participate in a central unity to create this thing that is the rock. The rock itself participates in a broader structure. Some components are more relevant to certain purposes than others. If we think about the relatedness of a rock to my purpose, the purpose for my life, or the purpose of the table that's in front of me, there'd probably be many degrees of separation between the two. Now, of course, I don't maintain that all is one, because we've established through many reasonings that it would be impossible for all things to be maintained in a unity that is unchanging. There can be these undulating experiences, though, by which we have the ability to maintain multiplicity and unity without collapse. Now, on the other hand, though, the structure of the one and of that purity seems to be a contradiction to what I have said. And the reason I say that is because we've come to establish that it is necessary for multiplicity and plurality and being and non-being to work together to maintain themselves, because they by themselves are unstable. They sort of need that partner. But with the partner, there are some logical restraints on what necessarily the one, the singular, the absolute singular, would be composed of, but also restricted in its participation. We've established that this thing is outside of dimensional measure, I guess we can call it, such that it's not about length, it's not about distance, it's not about speed, it's not about its charge, it's not about material causes, really. It's about conditions, it's about understanding, it's about conditions, I think, can be construed in many ways. So what I'd like to do now, then, is to think about structure, to think about principle, to think about ground. These three terms are terms that are used continually by me to describe the basis by which the one uses its being, I guess. And I say use loosely, exercises its being to maintain order in reality. So I want to go through these three that I mentioned, starting with structure. We can say structure is the pattern or arrangement that gives form to something. And we have to be careful here not to think temporally. We are not thinking temporally, we are thinking non-spatially, I suppose, logically. Structurally, I think would be a better way to describe it, but still, we're trying to get into defining what the structure is. So, again, it's a pattern that gives form to something. So at this basic level, the giving of form, how is this possible? Again, thinking outside of materially causal or temporal grounds. From here, it seems that logic and intellect are required. Especially since we're not talking about physical or spatial structures. We're talking about a logical arrangement. The logical underlying order that makes all differentiation possible. So, we've spoken of this many times. The pluralism argument of the sophist is a strong one. The sort of marriage between the king and the queen, where the king is that which is and the queen is that which is not, or non-being. And in this way, we don't really have the one as we have it here in Parmenides. It's more of a duality. I've called it a plurality, but it's a plurality in the sense that it's more than one. And then we have these interrelated experiences of multiplicity and singularity, or of unity, which I think is a constant of our experience. It's something that is true. But this concept of the fundamental ground is now our central question. And I suppose it was a question then as well, but I'm not satisfied by the way that it was concluded. So structure, I go back to, I guess, a temporal example, but we'll try to make it temporal only briefly. The blueprint, or even the frame of the house. The blueprint is the thing that gives coherence to the form. And a blueprint without a temporal backing is something that is intellectual. It is something that is logical. I can't quite say that it's something that is aware, something that is conscious. But there's something in here, surely, that needs to be explored much more. For this space, this giving of form, it seems to be quite productive, quite generative. Of course, anybody who believes in God understands that God is generative. God is responsible for creation. God is the one. Now, when we speak of principle, we think of a fundamental truth or law that underlies the way in which something operates. So a principle could be the nature of something's form. Again, I don't want to think temporally here, but I almost feel the pull of thinking temporally to be drawn backwards into the place where that temporal experience began, which is what we are after. If we are to say that the one is a principle, we mean it's the most basic underlying law of unity. Not necessarily the most basic underlying law of material causality, but it's the basic underlying law of unity. This is an intellectual concept. While in the Sophist we spent much time talking about the relationship between being and non-being, we didn't necessarily talk about, in the particular type of detail that we are prompted here to consider, as being itself. Now, being itself is a difficult thing. The mind goes here and there, thinking about multiplicities and unities. The mind tries to grab onto something that is most basic, because the step before that is the place at which we would identify the one to have most influence. But even this is not, I think, a good way to think about it, because it's not just a matter of a crossover or bridge between two worlds. The two worlds exist together. They exist integrated. They exist in a manner that is inseparable. And while if I turn myself inward, or if I turn inward on myself, I don't necessarily see something that is completely unified, but it has qualities of this unity. And there's something about this constancy right now, as I can identify it, even given the fact that it is time dependent and that it will perish at some point. The underlying principle that causes my stability of unity is not something that comes into being or passes away. It's something that endures, and it's always true. The principle itself doesn't do anything. I do something on top of that principle. It's the reason why things can be ordered or be intelligible at all, or be something that can be aware of its being and continue to be, even though it is bound by forces of differentiation or of multiplicity as well. Now, there's another interesting question here that relates to the sophist, in the sense that of multiplicity we can say the same thing. But in the sophist we had a more subtle argument, in the sense that multiplicity is grounded in being, in the sense that its existence depends on being, because that's the only way that it can interact and differentiate. But nonetheless, the question can be proposed. Is it the case that this multiplicity, just as much as the unity, can be seen from a place of fundamental separation, perhaps, or of fundamental differentiation, which might be a little bit different, still intellectual, still understanding and identifiable, but nonetheless different. But there seems to be a common principle, and that is of the ground, the concept of the foundational basis on which those things stand. If we say that the one is the ground, we are referring to the ultimate basis that supports all other existence, without itself being supported by anything else. It's not like the physical ground. It's a metaphysical ground, a layer of intelligibility that makes everything else possible. So we can say that the structure is the form or pattern that emerges from the principle of unity. The ground is the underlying reality that allows structure and principle to hold everything up. Now, Parmenides says, and it won't be different from another, as long as it is one. For it is not proper to one to be different from something, but proper to different from another alone, and to nothing else. So this gets into our fundamental, well, I don't want to use fundamental too frequently here, but this gets into an issue of difference, of non-being. He says, and it won't be different from another as long as it is one. This has been firmly established by our reflections. Oneness cannot be purely one if it is built up of parts, or if it is part of a multiplicity, participating in some more fundamental unity, because again, this thing is the ground. And he says a peculiar thing. He says, for it is not proper to be one, to be different from something. Again, we've established that. But proper to different from another alone, and to nothing else. So here, I've had some difficulty interpreting what Parmenides is getting at. In one sense, there's an image, perhaps, of this potential oneness existing, and a hypothetical for which aloneness or another exist as these fundamental principles. And as far as there is difference in any capacity relating to the one, it's the fact that its singularity its principled nature is something that is without anything else, that causes, at the very minimum, the possibility of conceiving of a difference to ground, which in and of itself wouldn't make any sense. But any difference that is found there, it seems that Parmenides is suggesting that the fact that it is alone in that purity of oneness seems to be enough to describe its capacity to participate in difference, perhaps. Maybe I have this wrong. Now, when I think about this word proper, what he means is that what belongs to something in virtue of what that thing is. And he's speaking of two things. He's speaking of oneness and difference, and what follows from its essence as such. So what is proper to the one must follow from being one, and what is proper to difference must follow from being different. So I think I had this slightly wrong, and it would correct this, what I perceived initially as a grammatical error. So I'll read this again. And it won't be different from another, as long as it is one. For it is not proper to one, so this should be in italics, I think, not proper to the one, oneness, the principle of unity, to be different from something. But he says it is proper to different, or difference in italics, as it ought to be, but proper to different from another alone, and to nothing else. So it's not in the sense that oneness is participates in difference to this sort of marginal degree. It's not within the nature of oneness to participate in difference. It is difference's nature to participate in its indifference in that way, because it is what it is. Difference is from another. It is that relationship. From another, we see multiple identities. We see boundaries between identities. We see different types of identities. But in one, we have that thing that is the unified source. Without part, without differentiation. Okay, so today happens to be a new day, and like usual, a new day brings new thoughts. So I thought I'd reflect a bit on something that I think I'm seeing. It seems like in our exploration, the focus is landed on, similar to the sophist, the concept of being and non-being. That of something, and not necessarily of nothing, but of non-being. Maybe I should make a clarification. We could say no thing in the sense that we are saying no thing, but not nothing in the sense of absence. I think there's a distinction that needs to be drawn there. And the relationship that we are building is of what's what is of particular interest. There's an image, I think, in the sophist where being and non-being are much more leveled with each other than what we are exploring here, whereas oneness is really the thing that undergirds all of it. Difference, we're not really sure where it fits in, because it's so related to that procedure by which identity multiplies and relates to other things and maintains the principle that it was founded on, and that is of being. But we get a clue in terms of where to place this difference when he says, but proper to different from another alone and to nothing else. In my mind, at least, it gives us an image of a particular, I want to say, space. I know that I'm a bit temporal in my speaking, and it's not good to perhaps always keep it there. There should be some better image that I can come up with. But, on the other hand, we are dealing with the sensible order. If we're going to be talking about difference and oneness, it's not that structured place where we just came from. It is, well, it's not structured in the sense that we speak of the one. It is structured in the sense that it, what can we say, has the structure of one, or participates in the structure of one. So this difference being in this other place, this sensible order, it's not the worst thing in the world to think in terms of what we're more used to, given that this is our experience. We can think of causal factors, we can think of these material factors, and use them as analogies to fulfill these philosophical ideals. Of course, they break down at some point. Where the language of the intellect has to come back in. Because it's not just observing that one thing is different from another in the temporal sense. We are also observing their ontological expression more than, along with, than just their physical. The ontological is their being, the purpose that it's tied to, the way in which it is able to effect and to be affected. All of these are observations on the side of the intellect. Or we could also say, I think, because we have that capacity, on the part of the subject. Now, through the subject's point of view, I see the physical separation between the table and the chair. What I see is a tangible space by which something that is and something else that is physically separated by space. I know this because I can see the discontinuity or the difference between them. In the middle there is the underlying carpet that is visible. And so, although this experience is intuitive, and it doesn't need much more than that to understand the concept, on a certain level, the intellectual domain, or the domain of the intellect, or the domain that the one seemingly participates in, I could be wrong about this, but it seems like, since the one is outside of space and time, it finds itself within this, more within this described space. Also, keeping this alive in our minds, that difference, the meaning of difference occupies this space. And it's such an interesting thing to think about, the vertical, that we find ourselves at the bottom, at a material experience that is not necessarily unreasoned or has been influenced in absence of the intellect. Even the most remote material things, because they participate in this one thing, or participate in unity. They participate not necessarily in its identity. They participate by what it affords, what it allows for. At least this is where we are in our current understanding. Not quite harmonious yet, but it seems to be at least getting somewhere. So back to this idea of difference. Again, to repeat what Parmenides says, but proper to different from another alone, and to nothing else. So one thing that might be interesting to think about is this idea of from another. Christmas has just passed, and for whatever reason, my friends and I still exchange gifts. Now, what I think about is the gifts themselves, and then how we say to and how we say from. And in the idea of where the gifts are from, we know that they originate. Both the idea and the material originates with them, or at least they procured the material such to transmit it forward. And it's interesting in a way when we think about difference. We think about this word from another. It's almost as if when we speak of individual identities, and especially individual identities as they relate to each other, that there's something of the quality and the character of difference that is given, that what is received by another identity is that of the difference. So again, one identity receiving something from something else is what, essentially? What exactly, I should say. I suppose we could say it's a declarative, maybe in a sense, depending on the relation. If it is a declarative, what does that mean? Well, it means that the identity that is coming into contact with another is saying that I am at a certain degree of certainty. The other thing is saying that I am also. And so this I amness is from the identity in question. Now there are different of the particulars of the sensible order. There are plenty of things that may say that they are, but readily give much of that which they are to something else, to form these mixtures and multiplicities. And others are strong in their identity, perhaps, but willing to associate such that a strong unity comes about. And so within all of these different scenarios, I see just that, the abundance of scenarios by which identities as they are use the giving of difference as a way to establish where they are in terms of a multiplicity and a unity. And among the material things, outside of the conscious experience like man has, it plays out as it plays out. The intellect, of course, underlying it, allowing its existence, affording its existence. But all the same, it's not necessary for my table and my chair to be aware of themselves, to be. Now that may seem obvious. Now, in order that we may more clearly revisit this term intellect, and revisit just a moment ago the thought and reflection on the various ways in which unity and multiplicity exist, and moreover, of the unity and of the parts, or of the plurality, or of the multiplicity. In what way do these things interact with each other? How is it that their interactions are adjusted or modified based on the difference that they give? Since I'd like to use this now, I think this is a useful tool. The giving of difference. And by extension, as we say, this giving of difference, exactly then how non-being weaves its way into all of these things, that of the multiple, that of the singular. Now the intellect, just to revisit this, is not a thinking subject or an activity. It is another one of these structures or conditions under which intelligibility is possible at all. It names the structural openness by which unity, order, and form can be present rather than collapsing into indeterminacy or nothing. So the intellect does not understand in the active sense, but it makes understanding possible. So if we go back to this idea of the intellect naming something, we have a parallel here to Genesis, in which God names the animals, establishes all things, essentially, but naming the animals is a particular. Well, there's an even deeper reflection, because in some sense it is man's responsibility to name the animals. So he's given this capacity, this intellectual capacity. But it's not really understanding, because we can name something without understanding the thing. It's not until we, I think, have some degree of understanding that we understand what it's for, or how it participates with other things. We can name it insofar as we identify it, and that is the intellect, I think. Now, the concept of structural openness is one that we are continually honing in on, because it's within this space that we find ourselves, or at least I find myself, most constrained. Constrained in the sense that I am unsure how to preserve the purity of the one while reconciling its relationship with multiplicity and unity, again, in this sort of interlocking, interwoven, undulating series of relationships. Before, and a few times now, we've layered through or layered over the surface by mentioning, by saying that the way in which it is related, when I say which, that is the one, the way in which the one is related to the expressions of the sensible order, is by providing the structural ground. And we've gone into some detail about the definition about structure and ground and principle. And these are quite important. But nonetheless, my mind keeps coming back here. And this structural openness, perhaps it's because multiple days have gone by and maybe there's a clarity that I had understood at a time past, but all the same, I still think that there's something missing. And that something missing is, what is the structural openness? Of course, it allows unity, it allows order. It allows that it avoids against the absolutes of things. I think it avoids against the absolutes because the ground is sort of the absolute, in a way. It would be it's a strange thing to say, well, how can the absolute be something that is limiting or providing the principle of determinacy, avoiding absolute indeterminacy, but also affording a degree of randomness, which would be, I suppose, a degree of indeterminacy, but all the same grounded on particular interactions and types of relationships. And here I have to give caution to myself for the level at which I express my ability to see that which is intelligible. I have to understand that I'm a subject, that I exist on a particular plane. In the Old Testament, we have this image of the divine staircase. We can speak of the vertical and the horizontal components of these, but generally speaking, the higher one ascends on this staircase, the more they understand about where they are in the hierarchy of mind and of understanding things. And there happens to be a hierarchy within the layer that he's in. I don't want to draw too strict bounds about what the mind can and can't do, but I think it's obvious where the limitations are. It should be obvious to anybody where their own limitations are. And in my experience, it has been the case that through discipline and reflection, it is possible to achieve something, and to achieve something good, which also means that there is a type of transcendence that takes place. At the very least, we can say it's a transformation. And I choose to see this transformation on that divine staircase. I don't want to get into the Old Testament image here. I don't want to open that up necessarily quite yet here. I long to get back to some of the Old Testament writings, but for now, we are in the Plato's sphere. We are in that sort of rational, deductive mode. We're searching for the primary. We're giving an ontological ground for that which is. This broader agentic space for which God may find himself or participate in through our experience, or at the level of our experience we perceive it in that way. This is a question for later. We are wrestling now with something more simple, basic, the purity of that oneness. So I think it's time to move on from where we were at with when Parmenides says, "For it is not proper to one to be different from something, but proper to different from another alone, and to nothing else." It afforded us quite the exercise. He says, "Therefore it won't be different by being one." Yet, if it isn't different by being one, it will not be so by itself. And if it isn't so by itself, it will not itself be so. I was hoping for an easy end to this paragraph, but I think this is going to be an even more challenging reflection than that little excursion that we went on to describe difference. So in the first instance, it seems like it makes all the sense in the world. He says, "Therefore, it won't be different by being one." So again, I want to bring the mind to the reflection that this oneness is not separated in the sense that there's no relation, but different in terms of the angle of attention, at least our attention to it. This business of the singular occupying difference, like in the case that I find myself here in my apartment, I am a singular person, sitting among many different things that participate in all sorts of different purposes and unities. My oneness, my being, necessitates the influence of difference. But again, the oneness that we speak of now is not measured by the influence of difference. For it is the nature of the one to afford the conditions by which the sensible order of being and non-being and their intermarriage, or in the statesman type context, their interweaving, their harmony, that then we find a justification for a type of expression saying that being one makes you different. There's a common language in the culture of uniqueness, and how uniqueness is a potential strength, or difference is a strength. But they're saying by that unity that is singular from the multiplicity, there is strength in that difference. But again, all the same, the bigger picture is that difference is afforded by the ground that whoever is, in terms of the name or the attention that we place to them, the intelligibility of that thing depends on the ground, on the structure, on the one. And it is by that ground and structure that the rules are changed, or maybe not the rules, but the perspective is changed. So no longer is the one measured by its relations, but the one is measured by its it's not capacity. It precedes capacity. The one is measured by its facilitation is a word that I've used often. We can use capacity insofar as we say that it is the ability to allow, the ability to facilitate. So today happens to be a new day. Like always, a new day brings new thoughts. So I'd like to get back into this idea of the terms that are used to describe the one, or the one's purpose, I guess, what it does. So we have facilitation, we have affordance. We say that it is, or that it has structural ground. It is principle. It makes intelligibility possible. It makes, at all of the various levels, unification and multiplicity possible. So another potential pathway to build on this and to learn a little bit more is to integrate what Parmenides is saying here. He says, yet if it isn't different by being one, as again, out of everything in our experience, we can identify oneness in all things, but yet by its oneness also there in tandem rests difference, to differentiate it, to outline it, to partition it, whatever. Again, yet if it isn't different by being one, it will not be so by itself. He's saying it will not be different by itself. And I probably touched on this yesterday, but again, memory is a fleeting thing, unfortunately. And while I do remember aspects of our discussion yesterday, the mind still requires this time to build back up and to remember. So let's try it from this angle. There is a type of oneness that does not require difference. And so by that condition, I have to ask, well, first of all, is there any productive space here? And then secondly, and what comes back to me now is the memories of that we have been through this. But there's still something itching at me, a reflection that is bound within this thing of, what would we call it? A character difference between the unity of the one and the unity of one in the sensible order. The primary character difference, I think we've already discussed. It's this facilitatory structural ground, a principled basis for which things come to be sustained, to be intelligible. Much like the unity of the sensible order, it doesn't depend on space and time. It doesn't depend on these dimensional measurements. But the dimensional measurements, space and time, all that, do depend on the one. Now Parmenides continues and he says, and if it isn't so by itself, it will not itself be so. He's essentially just stating the argument that the one is not different, doesn't occupy the space of difference, it's not influenced by difference. He says, and if it is itself in no way different, it will be different from nothing. I'm not sure about the language here. If we are establishing that it is not different, then why would we use difference to describe its relationship to nothing? So while in one sense we could say that this is true, but there's also that risk that we get into by saying if it is different from nothing, then, well, it may, if it's not different from nothing, then it is nothing. If I am not different than an alcoholic, then perhaps I am an alcoholic, or I share qualities of the alcoholic that are more fundamental. But of course I'm not an alcoholic, and so to say that I would not be different would be incorrect, because there's a strong way in which I'm different from an alcoholic. I don't drink as an alcoholic does. I think it's better to be keeping the mind where we have been, in that place of structural ground. So if difference has no place there, then we shouldn't speak of difference, just as we don't speak of dimensions in this space. And he says, nor will it be the same as itself. The nature of the one is not, of course, also that of the same. So this is something that we've gone through before. Another useful exercise, I think. Sameness, in an ironic sense, implies difference. And I say that it implies difference because if we are to say that one thing is the same as the other, let's say I have two sets of books, Gibbon's History of Rome. I was given one as a present, and I bought one by myself. And they happen to be the same publisher, the same exact copies. They are not themselves the same in a fundamental sense, in that they do not occupy the same space at the same time. But they are the same in all of their qualities, which makes them the same. But they are the same through a fundamental quality of difference, such that although they may share most things in common, they differ in certain fundamental areas. And those fundamental areas have to do with being. That there is a separation in being. But in the one there is no separation in being. It just is. Parmenides continues, he says, because it is not the case whenever a thing comes to be the same as something. It comes to be one. If it comes to be the same as the many, it must come to be many, not one. So I think this is a slightly different angle that I took just a moment ago. He's not really talking about, at least at first glance, I don't think he's talking about how this idea of sameness, how it relates to the sensible order, and not so much to, well, it relates to both, obviously, the sensible and also the intelligible order. I forget now what we even labeled it as, because this conversation about the one and this purity of the thing has really been taking a central place in my mind. But nonetheless, I think we have to, for a moment, sacrifice the idea of how sameness can, or how sameness must necessarily include difference. And also, I'll leave myself open to the idea that perhaps this is incorrect. But all the same, I want to wrestle with what he has to say here. So it's a possibility, if the one came to be the same as the many, it must come to be many and not one. So by sameness, again, I do think about principles. So we can avoid some of the confusion here. And let's just say the principles that undergird multiplicity, these principles, I think eventually there is an intersect, but a unique type of intersect. And what do I mean there? There's a sameness as it relates to principles. It may not be the same principle, but principles nonetheless. Now, given that we're talking about the ground through which being, capacity, intelligibility is afforded, it would be easy to assume that there would be a shared experience or shared qualities. But again, this sameness seems to be at a different layer of reality. That the sameness that we speak of, just much like the previous conversation of difference, it just doesn't apply to the structural ground. For what are we to say is the same between one thing and many things that have a relationship to it? We are not saying the principle of being many is the same. We are saying that the very process of coming to be and being itself has its ordering structure afforded by the one. Eventually, I promise, we'll come to progressive language. And progressive, I mean that we're adding to what we already understand. I can't get away from this affordance and this structure, principle, whatever. Not that this is bad, but because I'm hungry for the next step, the next level. So back to Parmenides. If it comes to be the same as the many, it must come to be many and not one. True, says Aristotle. But if the one and the same in no way differ, whenever something came to be the same, it would always come to be one. And whenever it came to be one, it would always come to be the same. So we pause here for a moment. I think that this is approaching more closely the dialogue that I had earlier about this necessary separation between the purity of oneness and of sameness, or of sameness not implying oneness. So we understand that although oneness is involved in distinction of sameness, there is no equivalence between that which is the same and that which is one. And the examples of this have been stated, but once more, the book. I have two books that are the same. One is two copies of these books. The books themselves participate in oneness, but each book is not the other. They are not equivalent in that sense. Their being is separate. He says, and whenever it came to be one, it would always come to be the same. Certainly. Therefore, if the one is to be the same as itself, it won't be one with itself. And so we have this, what appears in my mind as this infinite regress, by which there is this false equivalency. The basis is a false equivalency. What causes us to spin and spiral downwards, or to spiral out, is the inconsistency between sameness and oneness, in trying to draw that false equivalency. And what do I mean? Well, I suppose I'm beginning from the axioms that I've stated before, that sameness is is almost an extension of difference, or at least that it requires difference in non-being to be a useful concept. There is a comparative structure that's inherent to sameness. And in pure oneness, there need not be this comparative anything. For it is not, the one that we speak of is not something that you compare to something else, because something else is built on top of it. It's if we say the same, we are identifying characteristics that would be very principled and very unique and foundational to the thing itself, like being, but it would be sufficiently broad to exclude any reasonable determination of sameness. Like, for example, the chair that I'm looking at, my dining room chair, it's white, it has a beige cushion on it, or maybe beige gray cushion on it. My chair is the same as the floor. Now, the floor is a laminate floor. It's this faux wood structure. It's gray, has a shine to it. Now, in no way in appearance are they the same. In no way in terms of purpose are they the same. But there's a quality by which they participate in hardness. And so there's a similarity there. Now, the distinction of oneness and shared participation in comparison to the unified one that we were talking about, it doesn't really match up there, but I think this analogy is enough to show that the degree of separation would be inconsistent with what a reasonable person would consider one object to be the same as another. There has to be more characteristics, more similarities, more connections for us to say that something is the same as something else. And again, when we speak of the one, the principles are so fundamental, they're fundamental to all things. And so either we say that the one is the same, one is the same as all things, or the one does not participate in sameness. And I think that we ought to say that the one does not participate in sameness. Sameness participates in the what the one affords. So now back to Parmenides to tackle what he's saying specifically. But if the one and the same in no way differ, whenever something came to be the same, it would always come to be one. So practically, how would this manifest? So if we take the principle of one, barring the purity of one, the capital one, I speak of, let's say, the book that's in front of me. There's a principle of oneness that it occupies, surely. It participates in unity. Now, if I were to say that this book is the same as another, it would, and it always referred back to, at least, of course, as we speak of this now, in the sensible order, so referring back to this book, this particular unity, it wouldn't make any sense. Every time we use the word the same, it wouldn't make any sense. So it doesn't make sense in the sensible order, nor does it make sense in the intelligible. We've discussed why that, at least for my part, why that is, but I think there's something maybe a slightly more nuanced here that I may be missing. Not in terms of the intelligible order. I think that that's okay. But specifically to this analogy between the book, it's participating in one, and then having the same being the same as one. We can go a little bit deeper, I think, even in the sensible order, by saying, let's say oneness in general. Oneness as we understand the mechanics in the sensible order. That there are many multiple things, there are many singular things, and we can recognize the multiple that participates in the singular, and the singular that participates in the multiple. If we are to say of any of these singulars that the singular is the same, that would be bizarre, because there are many singulars. I see a book, I see a phone, I see a tablet, I see my cat's watering bowl, I see my cat's food dish, I see my end table, I see a painting. All of these things are one, but they are not the same. So it cannot be the same that one is the same. They differ. So this is exactly, I think, my point before. It is because of difference that oneness is not the same. So, in terms of practical consequences, if this were true, again, imagining this landscape that the sensible order is, we would have, I want to say we would have the destruction of uniqueness at the base level, at the very least, because all singularities would be indistinguishable from another. Now, this is the primary contention, I think, in the sophist, that sort of argues against the oneness purity, that within the singular being there is the collapse of identity into oneness. And that itself, it doesn't really make any sense. Because there is, again, there's no difference, there's no intelligibility there. There's just sort of this backdrop of blankness. But what we are building here is something more than that, of course. So getting back to these practical consequences. If all unities that we see were made the same, they would be made indistinguishable. And even if there was one being that was left to observe it, that being, assuming some prior structure by which it was brought up in difference and with experience and all this sort of thing, it would find itself in an environment that is just its mind and its thoughts that were built on some prior system. Because again, what we would be reverting to is so here, I think there may be a logical inconsistency. Because I want to say what we are reverting to is the structural ground. Well, maybe there's not a logical consistency. I say that initially because I think I was stuck in the sensible order. But once we get to the structural ground, again, there's no place for difference. So it doesn't apply, it doesn't matter. Because what I wanted to say was that what we would be left with is the ground, the principle. But once we are there, it doesn't make any sense to have an observer looking at it. The observer depends on it, and the observer may observe other dependencies. But to say that the observer is observing the ground of its being makes sense in an abstract way, but not in the way that it would precede it. Because there's no ground for it to stand on to precede. So to run this over again, what we are saying is twofold. I think what Parmenides is getting at is twofold. One, that this operation, if it occurred in the sensible order, what we would have is a structural ground on top of a structural ground. So we would not have the sensible order. And so we would see the collapse of all that we understand. But this sameness distinction does not apply to the ground. So we cannot use it in this way. If the one is to be the same as itself, it won't be one with itself. Now I think this statement is slightly different. In a way. Because now I feel like he has changed to more of an intelligible frame. Because he's speaking of the one. I could be wrong, so I want to think about this for a minute. If the one is to be the same as itself, it won't be one with itself. So I take back what I said. It's possible to see this in two ways. One in the sensible, one in the intelligible. In the sensible, since it is grounded in this purity of being, oneness or unity to say that it is the same as itself is almost a contradiction. Again, it's something that's not needed, or redundant, I should say. Again, to reiterate, this sameness implies difference. It implies some comparison. It implies taking an identity and the qualities of that identity and overlaying it on another. If we are to say that I am the same as I am, I might as well just say I am, because there's no real purpose in saying I am the same as I am. If the one is to be the same as itself, it won't be one with itself. I think there's a slightly deeper aspect to this than I had originally thought. Now, the sameness part of this I understand. But with this idea of one with itself, I have to wonder at what that means. Because by one, what we mean is unity, a coming together of things that participate in a common purpose. the unity itself participating in some goal-directed end. So there almost implies a spirit, the intelligible side, and then the sensible side, in which it recognizes multiplicity participating in the unity. And then the spiritual side is the continuum by which that unity persists in time. The continuum being by itself a continuum, but in the sensible order it is perceived by time. And so what we might have in our case is a being that lives a finite lifespan. Again, the sensible order. We have cells that participate in a unity. And on the other hand, we have a spirit, something of a stable order of being that is, what is it formed of exactly? It is formed of sensible parts of the various material substructure, but it's not as though this substructure is seen to produce something that is magic. What is seen to be magic is sort of non-distinct language, nondescript language for this intelligible description. And what do I mean by this? Well, let's take death, for example. In this experience as I see it now, there is unity. There is a unity of expression. There's a unity of conscious experience. And again, it is goal-directed. My mind is stable for the moment. It's not being pulled apart in many different directions, perhaps like a schizophrenic might be. In death, what we see is that the parts fail to communicate with each other to preserve the unity. And it's by the failure of preservation of unity that we see death to occur. Sort of a disunification or multiplication of parts into an ununified mass, reintegrate into other components, into other unities, surely. But as far as I try to put my finger on this intellectual side, or rather the intelligible side, I find something that's not indescript. I find something that is not superstitious. We could say that it is supernatural, because what we're talking about is not necessarily nature, though nature participates in it. What I speak of is real, as I can feel it and I can recognize it as the words flow from my mouth, and as I look in front of me at everything that there is, at all of these paintings and all of the meaning that exists on the walls, the patterns that exist in the carpets. Everything is endowed with this intelligible sphere. In death, the end of the unity, much like sameness to a degree, in the sense that sameness requires multiplicity and unity for it to operate. Non-being requires being. Being requires a ground. And it is the being, I think, that we identify in unity, that on death we see being persist, but a particular unity falling away. And the persistence of being is something that is persisted by the intellect, something that is persisted by that which is intelligible, the ground of that which is intelligible. Thus, Parmenides says, it will be one and not one. But surely this is impossible. Therefore, the one can't be either different from another or the same as itself. It can't. Thus, the one can neither be different from nor the same as itself or another. Yes, you're quite right. So here I think I'm going to end this episode. Continue next time with part 6.